Okay. Welcome everyone to our talk today. I'm glad to introduce Dr. Usaama al-Azhami. Dr. Usaama al-Azhami is a Departmental Lecturer at the Contemporary Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford, and he's going to talk about his recently published monograph, Islam and Arab Revolutions, the Ulama between Democracy and Autocracy. So the way that this talk is structured is we will have Usaama will talk for around 40 minutes, and after that we'll have question and answer session. I would request those who want to ask questions to send me directly the questions they might have, questions or comments, and at the end we will give you floor to ask questions. So without further ado, Usaama, I'd like to ask you to please give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salman al-Azmi. Of course, my uncle, so I usually refer to as Salman Chachu, or Chachu more generally in Bengali. So hopefully everyone can see I'm sharing my screen, and this is the sort of cover of my book. I'm basically going to go over, maybe in the next 35 to 40 minutes, an overview of the text. And I'm more than happy to take questions, inshallah, after that. If anyone's interested in buying the text, I've offered some codes. If you are based in the UK, the one on the left, Hearst, is the publisher in the UK, so you can go to their website. And the one on the right is if you're in North America. One of the things that I tell sort of colleagues sometimes who might work in tangential fields is that you're more than welcome to wait for the paperback because it's coming out, inshallah, in September. So unfortunately, academic books tend to be quite expensive in hardback. So I think this is £50, but with the discount code, you get 35% off. Enough marketing, inshallah. The book is actually quite a serious covers a very serious topic, something I've been thinking about for nearly a decade at this point. For those who are unfamiliar, 2011 marked the beginning of what was referred to as the Arab Spring at the time, a series of revolutions which began in Tunisia in January of that year, and went through much of the Arab world. After Tunisia, the sort of next place to lose its dictator, as it were, was Egypt. And much of my book is focused on Egypt. Egypt deserves that level of attention for a number of reasons, including the fact that it's the most populous country in the Arab world, with at the moment around 100 million, over 100 million people. A decade ago, when it was the beginning of the Arab Spring, it was around 90 million people. And so it's quite sort of significant that a country as large as that, with a dictator who'd been in power for about 30 years at that point, that the dictator there was able to be overthrown, as it were. But the book focuses less on the politics and more on the political actions of certain religious scholars. And so the cover of the book being on the screen, it shows the central figure here is Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who probably gets the most attention. It's between Qaradawi and the person to his on the left side of this, or to his right, technically, Ali Gum'a. So Ali Gum'a is, as I've put it in the past, the main villain in the book. Qaradawi is, you could say, kind of the, I mean, it's not really a novel or a story, but he is one of the more positive characters in the book. And the person on the right is one of the more subtle villains, but really sort of an important figure in the Middle East to this day. He's effectively the most powerful ruler in the Middle East, Mohammed bin Zayed. So we'll talk about all of these people, inshallah. I'll try to keep to the time. This is a book which is almost 400 pages long, so to put that into 40 minutes is obviously a tall order. So please bear with me, inshallah. So the first two chapters basically look at, so I have an introduction where I kind of provide an outline of the text, and then I have 9 chapters. The first 2 chapters look at al-Qaradawi's response to the Tunisian and Egyptian revolution. Now, why does al-Qaradawi matter? Who is Yusuf al-Qaradawi? He's the chap on the right of the screen. He's an Egyptian scholar who's still alive, but very elderly at this point. He was born in 1926, so he's 96 this year, and he's basically a scholar who was one of the most recognized and respected graduates of al-Azhar University. But this would have been back in the 1950s. And he was also a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, someone who had met with the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood and indeed had been imprisoned for a short time in his youth with the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt under the military regime of Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser in I want to say in the 1950s. And Qaradawi is basically someone who moves to Qatar in the 1960s, and he settles there and has basically lived most of his life in Qatar. He was an extremely successful scholar, a student at al-Azhar, graduating top of his class, but then he went on after going to Qatar to become one of the most prolific authors in the Muslim world. He has something like 200 to 300 books written. At the same time as being sort of this scholarly figure, he's a Muslim Brotherhood activist and someone who was given by the Qataris a platform through Al Jazeera. He had a show on Al Jazeera, which aired for about 13 years, I want to say. Actually, I think more than that. So it aired for nearly sort of something like 17 years, from 1996 roughly till 2013. And on that show, he spoke about everything from democracy to the notions of human rights in Islam, or Islamic devotional questions, how to deal with, how to sort of benefit from the month of Ramadan, the month we're in right now. And so everything conceivable was covered in his show, Al-Sharia wal-Haya, the Sharia and Life. And when the Arab revolutions broke out, he became the most vocal supporter in the international scene among scholars to sort of like express his support for the Arab revolution. So he had a show on Al Jazeera just, I think, 3 days after the toppling of Tunisia's nearly 40-year dictator. And he basically praised the revolutionaries. And indeed, he sort of dealt with the delicate matter of the fact that this revolution in Tunisia was started up in December 2010 by someone setting themselves on fire. So through an act which was technically an act prohibited in Islam, but its outcome was something which was positive. And he sort of, I look at how he deals with the delicate matter of, okay, I'm supporting the outcome of something whose starting point was somewhat problematic from an Islamic perspective. But most importantly, he was a very systematic Islamic juristic sort of supporter of the revolutions against tyrannical regimes. In a context in which a lot of scholars were sponsored by the states that, they were sponsored by tyrannical regimes that basically demanded that they be obeyed, and who sought justification in Islam for their tyranny and for their sort of long-term rule, dictatorial rule. And so this is the dimension that I look at in quite extensive detail, looking at the sort of Islamic justifications that Qaradawi provides for, this sort of peaceful revolution. And he very emphatically highlights the idea of peaceful revolution. There are some complications to his legacy in the Arab revolutions, and we can talk about those if people are interested. At the same time, you have, and so Qaradawi is one figure. I've highlighted him because I wanted to look at the discourse of supporting the Arab revolutions. But there were other scholars as well. Quite a few scholars were supportive of the revolution. So I don't want to, paint an inaccurate picture of suggesting that Qaradawi was the only one. There were plenty of scholars. But at the same time, you had a number of anti-revolutionary scholars. And these were scholars who basically described even peaceful protests against people like Hosni Mubarak, the long-term dictator of Egypt, or Zainuddin bin Ali, the long-term dictator of Tunisia. They described protesting against these people as haram, so unequivocally prohibited in Islam. And it's not altogether surprising, given that these were people who were appointees of these governments. So I've got two figures in here. On the left, you have the Shaykh al-Azhar, Ahmad al-Tayyib, and on the right, you have Ali Gum'a, who, as I said, he was on the cover of my book. These were people who would, in 2013, after supporting Mubarak unsuccessfully, trying to uphold his rule, by 2013, when the Muslim Brotherhood was faced down by the Egyptian military in a coup, they supported the coup. Ali Gum'a in particular was vigorously supportive of the coup, but Ahmad al-Tayyib at least justified the undertaking of the coup. And these two figures are the most authoritative public religious figures in Egypt today. I mean, maybe not today. Ali Gum'a was at the time, the person on the right was the Grand Mufti. He's no longer. He was retired by the regime before the sort of like emergence of the coup. And Ahmad al-Tayyib was the Shaykh al-Azhar at the time, and he continues to be today. So following their support, and they're both state appointees, so that's why I was suggesting it's not altogether surprising, but state appointees can also be sort of dissidents. In a place like the UK, some people will remember we had a lot of dissent institutionally on the question of Brexit, whether it's from Parliament or whether it's from state institutions such as the Supreme Court. So it's not the case that being a state appointee is automatically something which makes you a state lackey, but in dictatorial regimes, it usually does, right? And at the same time as having people who are pro-revolutionary and anti-revolutionary, you also had certain scholars who were somewhere in between, but then kind of eventually become, I've described them as eventually counter-revolutionary. So I've got two figures here, and one of them is a little unusual to be seen in this context, perhaps, but I'll explain exactly why he's here. The person on the left is Hamza Yusuf. He's an American convert to Islam, one of the most recognized Islamic voices in the West, but he becomes conscripted into anti-revolutionary sort of activism in the Middle East, oddly enough. And the reason for that, in my view, is the picture of the right. On the right shows Mohammed bin Zayed kissing the head of someone called Abdullah bin Bayya, a prominent Mauritanian scholar based in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And he is eventually appointed as the Grand Mufti of the UAE, or the chair of the Fatwa Council, Emirates Fatwa Council. But, he is someone who is ambivalent about the Arab revolutions right from the beginning, right from 2011. And by 2013, he breaks off his relations with Yusuf al-Qaradawi, with whom he had been working for well over a decade at the International Union of Muslim Scholars. So Yusuf al-Qaradawi headed up an institution called the International Union of Muslim Scholars as its president. And one of the vice presidents, it had multiple vice presidents, but one of the four vice presidents was Abdullah bin Bayya. And Abdullah bin Bayya in 2013, shortly after the Egyptian coup, which I'll talk about in a moment, which marked the turning point within the Arab revolutions so it marked the point at which the dictatorial regime started to regain their sort of centrality and their sort of ability to crush those who were opposed to them. At that point, just after the Egyptian coup, Abdullah bin Bayya resigned from the International Union of Muslim Scholars and joined the UAE, or joined forces within a few months with the UAE to set up a counter-revolutionary institution called the Forum. Its name is interesting, and we'll talk about it more, called the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, FPPMS. So the name itself is sort of an act of PR, as it were. It's trying to suggest that it has a noble sort of cause behind it, And indeed, a scholar like Abdullah bin Bayya, quite a learned scholar, very likely believes that what he's doing is sort of ultimately noble, that he does feel that he's promoting peace. But for him, his conception of promoting peace, which has been studied by a colleague of mine, David Warren, in his fantastic book, Rivals in the Gulf, his conception of promoting peace is about, really being absolutely quiescent and obedient to tyrannical rulers. And this is also something that I discuss in my book around chapter 5 and also in chapter 9. So the UAE becomes this important player, and Abdullah bin Bayya is there. Now, I'm going to talk about the Egyptian coup, which I've been referring to on and off, over the last sort of few minutes. And I do want to highlight, if anyone has any questions about the Egyptian coup or about any of the slides that I've been sort of presenting, please feel free to put them in the chat and they will be addressed, inshallah, in the Q&A period. But the Egyptian coup is an event in July 2013, when Egypt's attempt to create a post dictatorial system, which is based on democratic legitimacy on the part of the authorities there, is crushed by the then defense minister turned sort of coup regime president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the person in the middle here, at the lectern. And you can see on his left, two sort of seats down, is Ahmad al-Tayyib, the Shaykh al-Azhar. And he's one of the people, I translate his, I think it was literally 2 minutes and 30 seconds speech at the Egyptian, in the context of the Egyptian coup, where he said this was justified because it's in the greater good, or in the greater interests of the country of Egypt, that we sort of remove the current ruler. So, in a sense, religion is again being utilized as a legitimating force for political sort of maneuvers undertaken by the dictatorial regime. One thing that we can talk about, inshallah, if people are interested afterwards, is the very notion of an Islamist, because I designate scholars like Ahmad al-Tayyib in this text as neo-traditionalist. It's a label that I use to refer to scholars who are of a certain orientation. But the scholars who are more closely tied to the Muslim Brotherhood, I describe them as Islamist in an academic sense, not in a sort of pejorative popular sense. But very often in the popular consciousness, or indeed in the academic discourse as well, an Islamist is a scholar, is a sort of person who invokes their religion in the benefit of their political sort of actions. And for me, one of the questions that I often find myself asking of that definition is, isn't Sisi utilizing religion to the advantage of his political maneuvers as well, when he is drawing on someone like Ahmad al-Tayyib? And therefore, is Sisi also an Islamist according to that definition? And so we can sort of explore the problems that arise from defining things in sort of curious ways, which are very often a reflection of certain prejudices that arise in maybe secular cultures. But when you try and apply, impose those sorts of normative systems, those value systems on various parts of the Muslim world, they don't really fit very well. Okay, so in the 2013 coup of July that year, you have the military come in and basically annul the constitutional order that has been created after the revolution. But in addition to that, they engage in a series of massacres, because a large number of people are opposed to this coup, and they protest on the streets. And of course, for the past couple of years, protest had been legitimated, unlike how it was under the dictatorial regime of Hosni Mubarak. In that context, the Egyptian military begins a series of crackdowns. So by late July, Sisi, calls for a quote-unquote mandate in order to sort of confront terrorism. That's how he presents it. And so he calls for mass protests in the streets of Egypt to support and justify his sort of killing, well, his confrontation of terrorists, as he put it. And these have been studied by a colleague of mine at Oxford University, Neil Ketchley, in his fantastic book, Egypt in a Time of Revolution. And he basically looks at the way in which those protests were orchestrated by the military with the full support of the deep state, whereas protests against the coup regime were ongoing. And once he had been able to show, Sisi had been able to show that there was actually some degree of popular support, even if it was, in part orchestrated by the coup regime, he was able to then go and viciously crack down on, opponents of the coup. And Egypt in this time was an extremely divided society. There was considerable popularity for the opposition to the Egyptian coup. There was considerable popularity for the military regime, just as there was considerable popularity for the opposition to the Egyptian coup. And it's worth highlighting that the Egyptian coup comes and removes a Muslim Brotherhood president and annuls a parliament which is dominated by I think the plurality of votes were, plurality of seats were in the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so the elections, which have, were documented by international observers, and you covered in an excellent book, which I will show the cover of in a moment, David Kirkpatrick's Into the Hands of the Soldiers, showed that there was electoral legitimacy on the part of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was just roughly a year old at that point. So in a sense, they needed to make some kind of move to show that these people are no longer popular. And so this is kind of post-revolutionary, sort of like popular justice, calling for a symbolic show of support for the military regime, which was part orchestrated by the coup regime, and then going ahead and literally killing dozens, in some cases hundreds, potentially even thousands of people on the streets of Egypt in broad daylight in many cases. And so I have this I think this is in chapter 6, but I go through the very actually it's in chapter 5, the sort of very horrifying massacres of sort of potentially thousands of people in the streets of Egypt using Kalashnikovs and military hardware, snipers firing from helicopters and buildings against unarmed civilians, basically. And this is something which Human Rights Watch called in a report, a very detailed, over 100 pages report that they produced a year after the massacre. They called it one of the world's largest killings of demonstrators in a single day in recent history. So this is anywhere in the world, it's one of the largest killings of massacres in recent history. And certainly it's the largest mass killing in modern Egyptian history. So, it's something which causes a certain amount of shock within circles opposed to the coup. But at the same time, within the Egyptian media, it was actively being celebrated and actively being supported. The media was at this point a mouthpiece for the military as well. It's quite shocking to read actually some of the testimonies of people afterwards coming to realize what they had done, what they had supported, what they had justified within Egyptian society. In any case, so that's one of the centerpieces of the text, where I kind of outline the terrible massacre that takes place. And as I said, Ahmad al-Tayyib expresses a certain degree of disquiet, but this figure, Ali Gum'a, actually supports the massacres even after the massacres. So I have a chapter which actually looks at the way in which he supports the massacres in a full-throated fashion, both in the lead up to the massacres, where he provides justifications, religious justifications for these massacres, drawing on the Quran and Hadith, in my view, sort of doing a selective cherry picking. And I kind of illustrate the way in which this is a very opportunistic way of sort of citing material on the part of someone who literally has no moral restraint to use and abuse sort of a tradition to justify literally anything that the Egyptian military asks him to do. And then 4 days after the massacre, he stands before maybe as many as 1,000 members of the military, including the coup president, Sisi, including the Minister of Interior at the time, Mohammed Ibrahim, who had, it's the Minister of Interior and their security forces, and the coup president, who was the defense minister at the time, and the basically Egyptian military. All of these forces came together to perpetrate the coup. And 4 days later, Ali Goma was giving a lecture to them, lionizing their activities and their behavior, and their sort of justifying it, saying that people had seen prophetic visions where the Prophet was supporting these sorts of actions, and saying his infamous words, if you find any sort of people, if a single bullet comes in your direction, then shoot to kill. And of course, the fact was that there were hardly any weapons in these protests, where there were tens of thousands of people in attendance. The Minister of Interior later on said, we found something like 15 weapons, meaning firearms. And a lot of these were improvised, homemade sort of firearms. So I think at its peak, it would have had close to 100,000 people in in the protests at Rabi'a, where these massacres took place. Sorry, did you have a question, or I don't know if someone had a question? No. Okay, so Ali Goma is, and I just for the interest of the reader and for the record in the English language, I've actually sort of translated both his sort of extensive speech to the military before the Rabaa Massacre and his extensive military address after the Rabaa Massacre. And so you can go and read the sort of person this person is. He's actually been handsomely rewarded afterwards for his service. And so he's a highly sort of respected public figure in Egyptian, on the part of the Egyptian sort of coup regime that exists today. And they would like him to, as far as I can tell, they would like him to become the Shaykh al-Azhar. But the Shaykh al-Azhar is not something which, one of the unusual sort of gains that the Azhar made in the process of all of this sort of upheaval in Egypt over the last decade is they managed to create a constitutional change that ensured that the Shaykh al-Azhar is not actually appointed by the president. It's now appointed by the sort of committee of scholars within the Azhar itself. And so, the president can't just remove the Shaykh al-Azhar as currently stands according to the constitution. That has to happen internally to the institution. So, I talk about the fact that Ali Goma apparently has long had ambitions to become the Shaykh al-Azhar. And that's one of the things that seems to have animated him in his, unstinting support for the Egyptian coup regime. Now, that's Ali Goma, and as I say, he's still sort of like a highly respected and supported figure on the part of the Egyptian military today and in Egyptian society. This was the book that I was referring to and the sort of report that I was referring to earlier. So this is David Kirkpatrick's book, which I cite from extensively in my book, particularly on the Rabaa Massacre. David Kirkpatrick was the New York Times bureau chief during this period in Egypt, and he was actually in Rabaa Square during. Sorry, I think my camera's frozen, and I will try to see if I can change that. But he was the bureau chief in Egypt at the time, and he was in the sort of Rabaa during the massacres that were taking place, and he basically documents a lot of these details that I've provided of snipers, Kalashnikovs, etc. He sort of also highlights how officers mostly didn't want to talk about the Rabaa Massacre afterwards, but people who he managed to speak to who were involved with it, said that actually the officers were told and charged up by their sort of commanding officers, telling them that these people were heavily armed and that they wanted to kill you, and they had killed other members of the security forces. They were basically telling them that these were basically ISIS occupying places like the center of Cairo and so on. Now, so it's really sort of a horrifying story. But at the same time, I'm speaking about the negativity of these scholars' activities. I want to sort of also highlight that I spend a good amount of time looking at the opposition of senior religious scholars. And I think I remember at the time, a lot of people were very troubled by the fact that I was myself, as someone who is an alim, and this is something I talk about in my introduction as well and in my epilogue, to see senior scholars whom I had quite a lot of respect for prior to these events go down this very dark path. And the reality is, of course, that these people were relatively isolated figures who were backed by the state, whereas the majority of scholars were very clearly opposed to this sort of behavior, majority of prominent scholars. But the reality is that a lot of these scholars are, silenced into fear, out of fear, because the circumstances were very dangerous and deadly in Egypt in 2013 and since then. And so despite that, a number of these scholars, including people like Ahmad al-Raysuni, Hassan al-Shafi'i and Muhammad Imara, who are two scholars who are in the sort of Azhar's senior scholarly body. And Hassan al-Shafi'i was an advisor to the Shaykh al-Azhar. And both of these scholars were people who vocally expressed their opposition to the coup, despite being figures within the establishment. And various other scholars, all of whom have some connection to the Azhar, except Ahmad al-Raysuni, were openly expressive of their opposition. So just on the photo on the right, I've got Ali al-Qaradaghi on the right, Yusuf al-Qaradawi in the middle, and Ahmad al-Raysuni on the left in the red hat. These are three of the scholars who are very much opposed to the coup and the massacres that followed. So despite their opposition to sort of these massacres, they still continued to advocate for peaceful protest. But the reality was that once the logic of military crackdowns had come into play, the reality was that peaceful protest was more or less powerless to confront those sorts of military hardware. And in addition, I mean, one of the things to bear in mind is that Egypt was a divided society at this point in time, and there was a groundswell of support for the military to engage in these sorts of crackdowns, particularly in light of the fact that the way in which they were being portrayed in the media, the way in which the vast majority of Egyptians would have been informed about these sorts of things was that these were troublemakers, they were terrorists, they were, out there to destroy Egypt and so on. And so I'm sure a lot of people have come to realize that that was a fabrication or a lie, but it doesn't change the fact that it's possible to crack down on peaceful protesters if there are divides and cleavages within society, and these people can be otherized on some level. I'm coming towards the end of my presentation, but I wanted to, I hope I've not got too many slides. I think I still have 2 or 3, but I'll try and wrap up, inshallah, and I would be happy to take any questions. And I just want to remind people that if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll try and address them in the final 20 minutes or so. So one of the things that happens, we're moving away from Egypt now, and this is something I discuss in chapter 9 mainly. One of the consequences of the counter-revolutionary sort of success of the coup is the empowering of counter-revolutionaries throughout the region. And this is partly because of the importance of Egypt as an as a center in the Arab world, as a kind of bellwether, as I say. And the one thing which I haven't highlighted at this point is the fact that the Egyptian coup was also supported heavily behind the scenes by the United Arab Emirates. And this, once it was successful, the UAE actually became very open about this. And they also sort of highlighted, they publicly offered huge amounts of money to subsidize the financial crisis that the Egyptian government was facing, at that time. So the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other sort of pro-autocracy states basically sent something like $12 billion immediately to Egypt. But over the coming sort of years, they would give tens of billions of dollars, according to David Kirkpatrick, and these are discussed in his book in greater detail. But these figures who were sort of part and parcel of this counter-revolutionary narrative, Ahmad al-Tayyib is recognized in the UAE and given a major award, which is probably worth something like $1 million or something. The Zayed Prize. I can't remember the exact name of the prize. These people are awarded systematically. Abdullah bin Bayya is basically appointed. He sets up a counter institution to the International Union of Muslim Scholars, which I referred to as the Forum for Promoting Peace. And I put that in scare quotes, so to speak, because it is really about promoting autocracy in the region, which is the antithesis of promoting peace. And the UAE, really sort of like beefs up its soft power promotion sort of toolkit. And eventually Abdullah bin Bayya becomes the chair of the Emirates Fatwa Council. And in the process of doing this, he declares the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. He justifies the UAE's normalization with Israel. Hamza Yusuf becomes a vice president to the forum, and basically is effectively as the vice president of the forum and also as a member of the Emirates Fatwa Council, is complicit in all of these official fatwas that are being given by the United Arab Emirates, by Abdullah bin Bayya and the institutions that he represents. And I guess this is my sort of like, I hope it's okay to go on for another minute or two, inshallah. But, in a sense, what you have is, and I talk about this in the second half of chapter 9, there's a mirroring, in my view, and this is why I've literally mirrored the images in a sense on the screen, between the discourses that justify autocracy and the autocrats that back those sorts of discourses, and phenomena like ISIS. And this is, argued by a number of scholars, and I've added my voice to this view, which is that the rise of ISIS, if you look at the timing, is exactly when these things, these Egyptian coup takes place. So Egyptian coup takes place in 2013. In 2014, ISIS is able to sort of really suddenly take over everything. I mean, sometimes that sort of timing difference isn't as significant. So the Rabaa Massacre takes place on the 14th of August in 2013. On the 21st of August, the chemical attacks against Ghouta in Damascus, on the outskirts of Damascus, takes place, killing an estimated 1,500 plus people, including as many as 500 children, if I recall correctly. So these sorts of things are interconnected because the local players are saying, okay, what's tolerable to the international community? What's tolerable to Washington? And it's about pushing those sorts of boundaries. And ISIS, of course, is partly a consequence of the fact that, look, you're not going to be able to do anything about these autocratic regimes. So the only way to deal with them is violence. And that logic really does apply for, places like Syria, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And a lot of the sorts of people who formed ISIS were, prisoners who had been detained in Syria, for example, by the Assad regime, who were deliberately released in order to radicalize and make violent the opposition to the Assad regime. And in other cases, these were people who were linked to the Iraq regime and had spent time in American prisons, but had the opportunity to basically create a counterinsurgency within Iraq after their release from prison. The Americans, of course, did. Obama actually said this explicitly in 2015. As president, he was kind of arguably trying to put his own predecessor under the bus, throw his predecessor under the bus and try and absolve himself of guilt, which he has plenty of. in this entire process because of all of these sort of actions taking place while he was the hegemon in the region. But he basically says, ISIS is in part a consequence of the Iraq war. And as he put it at the time, it's a lesson in the importance of aiming before you shoot, right? So recognizing that these things are deeply intertwined, the UAE's success in crushing democracy is, in my view, directly causally linkable to the rise of ISIS. With that, this is just my concluding slide, but I'm happy to just sort of say that, the conclusions kind of are reflective of the conclusions that I say in the book, that the Islamic tradition can be used and abused in various ways. And so it can be utilized for both pro and counter-revolutionary sort of justifications. But in my view, the reason counter-revolutionary justifications are sort of seem to be winning the day is because they're backed by military power, by military brute force. And so as long as ideas have to be supported by brute force and do not organically themselves, justify themselves, they will always be a threat. And so that's why I always, feel confident that the threat of sort of democratic Islamic ideals in the region will continue to be a threat for the autocrats in the region. With that, I hope to conclude. Thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, now's the time. Inshallah.